Hello, and welcome back to Twisted Tales and True Crime. Before we delve into today's story of love, betrayal, and a fortune to kill for, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single detail of how a detective unraveled a husband's perfect crime. Now, let's begin. The autumn sun cast long, golden fingers across the manicured lawns of Blackwood Manor, illuminating the crimson and amber leaves that clung to the ancient oaks. From the outside, the estate was a portrait of idyllic wealth and timeless elegance, a sprawling testament to the fortune of the Sterling family. But within its stone walls, a chill was setting in that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. Eleanora Sterling, heiress to the vast Sterling Vance fortune, lay propped against a mountain of silk pillows, her once vibrant face now pale and drawn. At 34, she should have been in the prime of her life, enjoying the fruits of a legacy that spanned generations. Instead, a mysterious and debilitating illness had held her captive in her own home for the better part of a year. Her laughter, once a melody that filled the grand halls, was now a faint echo in the quiet of her lavish bedroom. By her side, as he always was, sat her husband, Julian Sterling. To the world, he was the picture of devotion. A man of modest beginnings who had been swept into a world of unimaginable luxury, Julian played the part of the doting husband with a convincing tenderness. He read to her from leather-bound classics, spoon-fed her the bland broths her stomach could tolerate, and held her frail hand, his brow furrowed with a constant, loving concern. "Just a little more, my love," he would murmur, his voice a soothing balm as he offered her a sip of water. "For me," Eleanora would manage a weak smile, her trust in him absolute. "What would I do without you, Julian? You'll never have to find out," he would reply, his lips brushing her forehead. The finest doctors from across the globe had been summoned to Blackwood Manor. They came with their impressive credentials and their little black bags, poked and prodded, drew vials of blood, and left with shrugged shoulders and hefty consultation fees. They diagnosed her with everything from a rare autoimmune disorder to chronic fatigue syndrome, yet none of their treatments made a difference. Eleanora simply continued to waste away, a beautiful flower wilting on its stem. The staff of Blackwood Manor, a discreet and loyal cadre who had served the family for years, watched with a mixture of pity and unease. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, a woman whose stern demeanor hid a fiercely protective nature, found herself observing Julian with a growing sense of disquiet. He was almost too perfect, his concern a little too polished. She noticed how he managed Eleanora's medications with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive, never allowing anyone else to administer them. She saw the fleeting look of something cold and calculating in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. But she dismissed her thoughts as the overactive imagination of a worried old woman. After all, Mr. Sterling was a saint. Everyone said so. Detective Inspector Miles Corbin of the county's Major Crimes Unit would have disagreed, had he been privy to the goings-on at Blackwood Manor. Corbin was a man who didn't believe in saints, only in people with varying degrees of hidden agendas. He was a rumpled, weary-looking man in his late 40s, with a mind as sharp as a shard of glass. He had a knack for seeing the cracks in a perfect facade, the tells that others missed. But the Sterling case hadn't crossed his desk. It was a private family tragedy, not a police matter. At least not yet. The end for Eleanora came on a blustery Tuesday in October. A storm raged outside, rattling the window panes and stripping the last of the leaves from the trees. Julian was, of course, by her side. He would later tell the few friends who were permitted to visit that she had simply slipped away in her sleep, a peaceful end to her long suffering. The family doctor, a man who had been on the Sterling payroll for 2 decades, signed the death certificate without hesitation. Cause of death: complications from a prolonged and undiagnosed illness. It was tragic, but not unexpected. Julian Sterling played the part of the grieving widower to perfection. He was a study in dignified sorrow, his handsome face etched with a believable pain. He oversaw the funeral arrangements with a quiet competence, selecting the white lilies that Eleanora had loved and a casket of polished mahogany that cost more than a modest family home. At the funeral, he stood stoically by the graveside, a solitary figure against the gray, weeping sky. He accepted the condolences of Eleonora's society friends and distant relatives with a grateful nod and a choked whisper of, "Thank you for coming." They murmured amongst themselves about how devoted he had been, how tragic it was that he had lost his beautiful wife so young. Detective Corbin attended the funeral, though not in an official capacity. He knew the Sterling Vance name, of course. It was woven into the very fabric of the county. He was there at the request of an old friend, a retired judge who had been a close confidant of Eleonora's late father. The judge had his own unspoken reservations. "Watch the husband, Miles," the judge had said over a glass of whiskey the night before. "There was always something about him I couldn't quite put my finger on. He was too smooth, too eager to please." So Corbin watched. He stood at a respectable distance, his gaze sweeping over the somber crowd. He saw the genuine grief on the faces of the staff, particularly Mrs. Gable, whose eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. He saw the polite, almost performative sadness of the society acquaintances. And then he saw Julian. To the casual observer, Julian was the very picture of a man heartbroken. But Corbin wasn't a casual observer. He noticed that while Julian's shoulders slumped and his head was bowed, his eyes were dry. Not just dry, but alert. They darted around, taking in the mourners, assessing them. When a distant cousin of Eleonora's sobbed a little too loudly, Corbin saw a flicker of annoyance cross Julian's face before it was replaced by a mask of shared sorrow. It was a micro-expression, gone in an instant, but Corbin had seen it. After the funeral, the guests returned to Blackwood Manor for a subdued reception. Corbin, blending into the background, nursed a cup of tea he had no intention of drinking and listened. The conversations were a predictable mix of fond remembrances of Eleonora and sympathetic words for Julian. "He's been so strong through all of this," one woman in a pearl necklace whispered to her companion. "A rock," the other agreed. Eleonora was lucky to have him. Corbin moved through the opulent rooms, his eyes taking in the details. The house was a museum of inherited wealth, with priceless antiques, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and Aubusson carpets that muffled his footsteps. It was a world away from his own modest semi-detached house on the other side of town. He wondered what it must have been like for Julian, a man from a working-class background, to be thrust into this gilded cage. He found himself in the library, a magnificent two-story room lined with thousands of books. Julian was there, speaking with his solicitor, a man with a face like a well-fed bulldog. The solicitor was speaking in low, confidential tones, and Julian was nodding, his expression serious. As Corbin drew nearer, pretending to admire a collection of antique maps, he caught a snippet of their conversation. "The will is quite clear, Julian," the solicitor was saying. "Everything passes to you, the estate, the portfolio, the lot. It's an ironclad document." Julian let out a long, slow breath. Corbin, watching his reflection in the glass of a display case, saw a look of profound relief on his face. It was not the look of a grieving husband. It was the look of a man who had just won the lottery. The solicitor clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a very wealthy man, Julian. Eleonora made sure you would be well taken care of. She was always so generous," Julian said, his voice thick with a carefully constructed emotion. Corbin felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The judge's words echoed in his mind. Too smooth, too eager to please. He left the reception shortly after, the taste of weak tea and suspicion bitter in his mouth. On the drive back to his office, the pieces began to click into place. A young, healthy woman with no prior medical history suddenly falls ill with a mysterious ailment that baffles the best doctors. She withers away over the course of a year, conveniently isolating herself from all but her devoted husband. Her death is deemed natural, no autopsy is performed, and her husband, a man with no fortune of his own, inherits a vast, unimaginable sum. It was a narrative that was almost too neat, too tidy. Back in his cluttered office, surrounded by the comforting chaos of old case files and half-empty coffee mugs, Corbin began to dig. He started with Julian. A simple background check revealed a life that was unremarkable until he met Eleonora. He was a former art history student who had been working as a gallery assistant when he had charmed the wealthy heiress. They had a whirlwind romance, a lavish wedding, and then, a few years later, Eleonora's health had begun to decline. Corbin pulled up articles about their wedding, photos of the happy couple beaming. Eleonora, vibrant and full of life. Julian, handsome and adoring, his arm possessively around his new wife. He looked at photos taken more recently, paparazzi shots of the couple leaving a private clinic. Eleonora, frail and leaning heavily on Julian, her face a mask of pain. Julian, his expression a perfect blend of concern and protectiveness. Something was wrong. Corbin could feel it in his bones, the same instinct that had helped him solve dozens of cases. He knew he had no evidence, nothing more than a hunch and a few fleeting observations. But it was enough. He picked up the phone and called the county coroner, a man he had a long and occasionally contentious relationship with. Dr. Evans, it's Detective Inspector Corbin. Miles, the coroner grunted. To what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you've found another body in the woods. Not exactly, Corbin said, his voice even. I have a few questions about the death of Eleonora Sterling. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The Sterling Vance heiress? Sad business that. Her personal physician signed the death certificate. Prolonged illness. My office wasn't involved. I know, Corbin said, but I'd like you to be. I'm going to be petitioning a judge for an exhumation order. The coroner was silent for a long moment. On what grounds, Miles? You're going to need more than a bad feeling to dig up a woman of that prominence. I'm aware of that, Corbin said, his eyes fixed on the photograph of the smiling, newly wedded couple on his computer screen. But I have a feeling that if we look a little closer, we're going to find that Mrs. Sterling's illness wasn't so natural after all. He hung up the phone, the silence of his office pressing in on him. He knew he was about to kick a hornet's nest. The Sterling Vance name carried a lot of weight in this county, but he also knew that he couldn't let it go. He owed it to the woman with the vibrant smile in the photograph. He owed it to the truth. The long, slow process of unraveling Julian Sterling's perfect crime had just begun, and Detective Inspector Miles Corbin was a very, very patient man. The weeks following Eleonora's funeral settled into a quiet routine at Blackwood Manor, but it was a quiet laced with an undercurrent of change. Julian Sterling, now the sole master of the vast estate, began to shed his widower's weeds with a speed that Mrs. Gable found unseemly. The black ties were replaced with tastefully expensive silk ones, and the somber gray suits gave way to tailored jackets in shades of navy and charcoal. A new, top-of-the-line sports car, a machine of gleaming silver and roaring horsepower, appeared in the gravel driveway, a stark contrast to the stately, conservative vehicles Eleonora had preferred. Julian's grief, once a constant, palpable presence, seemed to evaporate like the morning mist over the manor's private lake. He was polite but distant with the staff, his mind clearly on other, more pressing matters. The solicitors, a flock of sharp-suited men with bulging briefcases, became frequent visitors. Their hushed conversations with Julian in the library would go on for hours, the subject always the same: the complex and labyrinthine Sterling Vance inheritance. Detective Corbin, meanwhile, was engaged in his own meticulous work. Securing the exhumation order had been an uphill battle, a delicate dance of legal maneuvering and quiet persuasion. The Sterling family's lawyers had fought it tooth and nail, accusing the police of a ghoulish and unwarranted intrusion into a private tragedy. But Corbin, backed by the discreet support of the old judge, had presented just enough circumstantial evidence: the suddenness of the illness, the lack of a definitive diagnosis, the immense financial motivito convince a skeptical magistrate. The exhumation itself was a grim, rain-soaked affair, conducted with as much discretion as possible. Corbin stood under a leaden sky, his trench coat collar turned up against the wind, and watched as the polished mahogany casket was raised from the earth. He felt a pang of something akin to pity for Eleonora Sterling, a woman he had never met but for whom he was now the unlikely champion. Her life had been one of unimaginable privilege, but her death, he suspected, had been lonely and terrifying. He'd placed a tale on Julian, a pair of plainclothes officers who reported on the widower's daily activities. Their reports painted a picture of a man eager to embrace his new life. There were lunches at exclusive city restaurants, meetings with architects about modernizing parts of the manor, and inquiries at a high-end art gallery about selling off several of Eleonora's most treasured paintings pieces she had inherited from her mother and had sworn never to part with. Corbin began his interviews at Blackwood Manor, starting with the staff. He was met with a wall of practiced discretion, but he was patient, his questioning gentle and probing. He spoke with Mrs. Gable in her cozy sitting room, the scent of lavender potpourri in the air. Mr. Sterling was a devoted husband, she said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He never left her side. I'm sure he was, Corbin said, his voice mild. Tell me about Mrs. Sterling's illness. Did she seem to be in pain? Mrs. Gable's composure wavered. A tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. At the end, yes, a great deal of pain. She was so weak, she could barely lift her head. It was her stomach, mostly, and a terrible fatigue. The doctors, they didn't seem to know what to do. And Mr. Sterling, he administered all her medication? Oh, yes, the housekeeper said. He was most particular about it. He kept a detailed chart of dosages and times. No one else was allowed to touch her pills or her special drinks. He said he didn't want any mistakes. Corbin made a note. Control. Julian had controlled every aspect of her care. He interviewed the groundskeepers, the cook, and Eleonora's personal assistant, a nervous young woman who seemed terrified of saying the wrong thing. From each of them, he gleaned small, seemingly insignificant details that, when pieced together, began to form a disturbing pattern. Julian had systematically isolated Eleonora. He had dismissed her longtime personal assistant, claiming she was too emotional, and hired a new one with no personal connection to the family. He had discouraged visits from her friends, telling them that Eleonora was too weak and that it was best not to excite her. He had changed her diet, insisting on preparing special health-boosting smoothies for her himself, smoothies that no one else ever saw or tasted. The most damning piece of information, however, came from an unexpected source. Corbin had tracked down a pharmacist in a neighboring town, a man who had recently retired. The pharmacist had been uneasy about a series of prescriptions he had filled for Julian Sterling over the past year. It was for a heart condition, the pharmacist explained, peering at Corbin over his spectacles. A fairly common medication, but the dosage he requested. It was unusually high, and he was paying in cash, insisting that it not go through his wife's official medical records. Said he didn't want to worry her. Did you find that odd? Corbin asked. At the time, I just thought he was a private man. But then I heard about Mrs. Sterling's death, and the symptoms that were described in the papers. The extreme fatigue, the digestive issues. They can be side effects of an overdose of that particular medication, administered over a long period. Corbin felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the first concrete piece of evidence. He now had a potential weapon, a method. The preliminary results from the toxicology report came in a week later. Dr. Evans called him personally. Miles, you were right to dig her up, the coroner said, his voice grim. We've found something. It's not the heart medication, not directly. It's something much more clever. We've found traces of thallium. Corbin's blood ran cold. Thallium, the classic poisoner's poison. Odorless, tasteless, and slow-acting. In small, repeated doses, it mimics the symptoms of a natural illness, a gradual wasting away. It's a heavy metal, Evans continued. Causes nerve damage, hair loss, gastrointestinal distress. All the symptoms Eleonora Sterling reportedly suffered from. In the final stages, it leads to organ failure. It's a nasty, brutal way to die. The pieces were no longer just clicking into place. They were slamming together. The special smoothies Julian had insisted on making himself. The gradual decline in Eleonora's health. The vague, shifting diagnoses from the doctors who had been looking for a disease, not a poison. Corbin now had the what and the how. He still needed the why, but he had a pretty good idea. $1 billion inheritance was a powerful motive. He decided it was time to talk to Julian Sterling. He drove up to Blackwood Manor, the silver sports car gleaming in the driveway like a taunt. Julian received him in the grand drawing room, a cavernous space with a roaring fire in the hearth. He was the picture of urbane sophistication, dressed in a cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed trousers. He offered Corbin a drink, which the detective declined. "Detective Inspector," Julian said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "I was told you were looking into my wife's death. I must say I find it rather macabre. The woman I loved has been put through enough. My condolences for your loss, Mr. Sterling," Corbin said, his voice neutral. "I'm just trying to tie up a few loose ends. Standard procedure." Corbin's questions were deliberately bland at first, covering the same ground he had with the staff. He watched Julian closely, observing his body language, the way his eyes never quite met the detective's. Julian's answers were polished, rehearsed. He spoke of Eleanora's courage, her long battle with her illness, his own helplessness as he watched her fade away. He was the perfect, grieving husband. But Corbin had an ace up his sleeve. "Mr. Sterling," he said, shifting the topic slightly, "I've been looking into your financial situation prior to your marriage. It seems you had a significant amount of debt. Student loans, a few failed business ventures." A flicker of something anger, perhaps, or fear crossed Julian's face before it was brought under control. "I don't see what that has to do with my wife's death. And yet, you now find yourself a man of considerable wealth," Corbin pressed on, his voice still quiet, almost conversational. "The sole heir to the Sterling Vance fortune." "My wife loved me," Julian said, his voice tight. "She wanted me to be taken care of. She also loved her family's legacy," Corbin countered. "Her friends told me she was fiercely protective of it. She would never have sold off those paintings, for instance." Julian stood up and walked over to the fireplace, his back to the detective. "Grief affects people in different ways, Inspector. I'm trying to move on, to build a new life." "A life built on a lie?" Corbin said, his voice hardening. Julian spun around, his mask of civility finally cracking. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying," Corbin said, standing to face him, "that Eleanora Sterling's illness wasn't an illness at all. I'm implying that she was poisoned, slowly, patiently, over the course of a year. Poisoned with a substance that is odorless and tasteless. Something that could easily be mixed into, say, a daily health smoothie." Julian's face went pale. For the first time, Corbin saw genuine fear in his eyes. "That's a monstrous accusation," Julian stammered. "Is it?" Corbin took a step closer. "We have the toxicology report, Mr. Sterling. We found the thallium. And we have a pharmacist who will testify that you were purchasing medications off the books, medications whose side effects mimic the early stages of thallium poisoning, perhaps to mask the true cause of her symptoms. And I'm willing to bet that if we get a warrant to search this house, we're going to find the rest of your little chemistry set." Julian stared at him, his mind racing, searching for an escape route. But there was none. The walls of his gilded cage were closing in. "You have no proof," he whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "We have more than enough," Corbin said, his voice cold as steel. "We have $1 billion motive, we have the means, and we have the opportunity. What we have, Mr. Sterling, is a murder." The silence in the grand room was broken only by the crackle of the fire. The perfect facade of Julian Sterling, the devoted husband, had been shattered. In its place was a cold, calculating killer, his desperate gamble for a fortune exposed. The game was over. All that was left was the checkmate. The arrest of Julian Sterling sent shockwaves through the insulated world of the county's elite. The story was a media sensation, a lurid tale of greed, betrayal, and high society murder. The headlines screamed of the poisoner playboy and the black widower of Blackwood Manor. The image of Julian, his handsome face a mixture of shock and indignation as he was led from his opulent home in handcuffs, was splashed across every newspaper and television screen. For Detective Inspector Miles Corbin, the arrest was not an end, but the beginning of a new, more painstaking phase of the investigation. He knew that Julian's high-priced legal team would tear into the prosecution's case, looking for any weakness, any shred of doubt. A toxicology report and a motive were a strong start, but to secure a conviction, Corbin needed to build an ironclad case. He needed to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, not just that Eleonora had been poisoned, but that Julian and only Julian could have done it. The search of Blackwood Manor was methodical and exhaustive. Corbin and his team, clad in sterile blue overalls, moved through the pristine rooms like a swarm of locusts, cataloging, bagging, and tagging every potential piece of evidence. Julian, out on bail but confined to a city apartment, could only watch on the news as his carefully constructed world was dismantled, piece by piece. The breakthrough came not in the grand library or the master suite, but in a small, forgotten corner of the estate. In the back of a rarely used potting shed, tucked away behind dusty bags of soil and rusty gardening tools, a forensics officer found a small, locked metal box. Inside, they found Julian's murder kit. It was chilling in its organization. There was a small, highly sensitive digital scale, a chemistry textbook with the chapter on heavy metals and their compounds dog-eared, and, most damningly, a small, lead-lined container holding a residue of a white, crystalline powder. The lab confirmed it was thallium sulfate, but there was more. The box also contained a small, leather-bound journal. It was Julian's diary. Corbin sat in his office late into the night, the only light coming from his desk lamp, and read. The diary was not a confession, not in the legal sense, but it was something far more insidious. It was a chronicle of Julian's twisted mind, a testament to his narcissism, his greed, and his utter contempt for the woman who had loved and trusted him. He wrote of his frustration with his own common background, his resentment of Eleonora's effortless wealth. He described her as a gilded cage, a beautiful but ultimately boring woman who was his ticket to the life he felt he deserved. He detailed his growing obsession with the idea of inheriting her fortune, his meticulous research into untraceable poisons, his decision to use thallium because of its ability to mimic a natural illness. He wrote about the first time he put the poison in her morning smoothie, his hand trembling slightly, his heart pounding. A small price to pay for $1 billion cure to my otherwise insignificant existence, he had written. He described how he had watched her, day by day, as the poison took hold, feigning concern, playing the part of the devoted husband while he was, in fact, her executioner. He wrote of his annoyance at her resilience, her refusal to die as quickly as he had hoped. The woman clings to life like a weed, one entry read. The diary was a portrait of pure, unadulterated evil. It was the voice of a man who saw other people not as human beings, but as obstacles or tools. Corbin felt a cold fury as he read, a fury he had not felt in years. Armed with the diary and the physical evidence from the potting shed, Corbin began to re-interview everyone connected to the case. With the knowledge of Julian's guilt now a certainty, the small inconsistencies and dismissed suspicions of the staff and friends now took on a new, more sinister meaning. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, wept as she recalled Julian's insistence on preparing Eleonora's drinks himself. "I thought he was being caring," she sobbed. "But he was killing her, right in front of me." Eleonora's former personal assistant, the one Julian had fired, told Corbin that she had been dismissed after she had questioned Julian about the new vitamins he was adding to Eleonora's regimen. "He became enraged," she recalled. "He told me I was overstepping my bounds and that my services were no longer required." The case that Corbin and the prosecution team built was a mountain of evidence, each piece interlocking with the next. They had the financial motive, the physical evidence of the poison and the tools used to administer it, the testimony of the pharmacist, the damning words of Julian's own diary, and the corroborating stories of those who had witnessed his controlling and deceptive behavior. The trial was the legal event of the decade. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, society gossips, and members of the public, all eager for a glimpse of the handsome, charismatic man accused of such a monstrous crime. Julian, dressed in impeccably tailored suits, sat at the defendant's table, his expression a carefully crafted mask of wronged innocence. His defense team, led by one of the most formidable lawyers in the country, argued that Julian was the victim of a tragic series of coincidences and a police force desperate for a high-profile conviction. They claimed the thallium was for pest control on the vast estate. They argued that the diary was a work of fiction, a private fantasy written by a man struggling with the emotional toll of his wife's illness. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a gift for storytelling, laid out the case for the jury, piece by damning piece. She painted a picture of a lonely, trusting woman and the predatory man who had taken advantage of her love. The climax of the trial came when Julian himself took the stand. It was a desperate gamble by his defense team, a last-ditch effort to charm the jury. He was articulate, composed, and utterly convincing as he spoke of his love for Eleonora, his voice cracking with emotion as he described her final days. But on cross-examination, the prosecutor slowly and systematically dismantled him. She used his own words against him, reading passages from the diary and forcing him to explain them. "A billion-dollar cure to your otherwise insignificant existence," she read, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "Are those the words of a loving husband, Mr. Sterling?" Julian faltered, his composure finally cracking. It was a figure of speech, a dark fantasy. "Was it a fantasy when you bought the digital scales, Mr. Sterling? Was it a fantasy when you mixed the poison into your wife's smoothie, day after day, and watched her waste away?" Julian's face, broadcast on television screens across the country, contorted with rage. The mask slipped, and for a moment, the jury and the world saw the cold, reptilian monster that lurked beneath the charming facade. The jury's deliberation was surprisingly short. They returned with a verdict in just under 4 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Corbin was in the courtroom to hear the verdict. He watched as the color drained from Julian's face, his look of arrogant self-assurance replaced by one of stunned disbelief. As he was led away in handcuffs for the last time, his eyes met Corbin's. In them, the detective saw not remorse, but a bottomless, venomous hatred. Later that evening, Corbin stood on the terrace of Blackwood Manor. The estate, now in the hands of a trust that would likely turn it into a museum or a public park, was quiet and still. The autumn air was crisp and clean. He thought of Eleonora Sterling, a woman whose name had been synonymous with wealth and privilege, but who had died a lonely, painful death at the hands of the man she loved. He had unraveled the plot, uncovered the truth, and brought a killer to justice. But there was no sense of triumph, only a weary sadness. He had looked into the abyss of human greed and had seen the devil in the details. As he turned to leave, his phone rang. It was the old judge. "I saw the verdict, Miles," the judge said, his voice warm. "You did well. You gave her justice." "I hope so," Corbin said, looking back at the darkened windows of the great house. The case of the Sterling inheritance was closed. But for Detective Inspector Miles Corbin, the memory of the gilded cage and the cold-blooded predator who had lurked within it would linger for a long, long time. He had done his job. He had spoken for the dead. And in the quiet solitude of the English countryside, that would have to be enough.